Pressure is peeling. What is this composition that Florida Mayhem are pulling out? Is it something that other teams can replicate, and why and how does it work? Now, pressure is peeling means that any damage that you do on the enemy team means that you're going to be forcing resources, forcing attention, or limiting their ability to actually pressure you. And this is very important for anti-dive. You see, a lot of people think when they think anti-dive, we're thinking Baptiste Lamb, we're thinking about armor packs, we're thinking about defense matrix, but that's only half of the equation, and ironically, the least important part of the equation. Actually, the best thing that you can be doing for dive prevention is to just simply prevent the dive in the first place. And that's usually from off-angle control and damage. If I'm able to shoot a tracer and force a recall while she's taking an angle, I don't have to worry about that tracer in my backline. If I'm able to force the Winston bubble before the dive, I don't have to worry about the Winston in my backline, and so on. And what Florida's composition is absolutely exceptional on is putting out a lot of damage during these staging phases and controlling off angles without significantly increasing their risk. You see, the problem with that early prevention mindset is it sometimes means that you put your heroes at risk. For example, an Ashe taking a very aggressive angle is at a risk of dying because she's playing a little bit more aggressively here. However, a Kiriko is not at a risk of dying. A Tracer, not at a risk of dying. And interestingly enough, a Ramattra is also not at a risk of dying by taking a more aggressive angle most of the time. And so really you only have the weak links of being the Ashe and the Baptiste, and really only the Ashe taking the aggressive angle. So if you want the quick TLDR of exactly how this composition works, it's allowing my Kiriko, Tracer, and Ramattra to play as aggressively as they possibly can without really demanding a lot of healing, the nature of those heroes. The Ashe plays very aggressively, but gets full pocketed by Bap and gets complete attention. And the Baptiste just plays to not die and doesn't really have to worry about much else other than that. And the interesting thing about this composition are two things. Number one, not only does it line up with theory, but it lines up with Florida's strengths. You see, Mara is a phenomenal Ashe, one of the best in the league, if not the best in the league currently right now. Someone is an excellent Ramattra, especially at playing around offensive cooldowns. And lastly, RuPaul is one of the best Baptiste in the league. It's definitely his strongest hero, so it's not only a composition that makes sense in Overwatch 2 macro theory, it also lines up with their hero strengths as well. Now, the second reason why this composition is being played, and part of the reason why I don't expect to see it a ton, although I will expect to see Florida continue to play it in certain circumstances, is the fact that they are playing two teams without strong Winston Sombra Tracer dive. You see, Gladiators have an argument for being one of the better dive teams, but they don't have the best Winston, and whenever they possibly can, they're going to avoid playing Winston on maps where they can. Dante is fine at Winston, but it's not a strong hero for him. In addition to that, they also played up against the Toronto Defiant. While Kaluge has been serviceable at Monkey, Kaluge is not the aggressive style Monkey, doesn't understand the macro to that level to where it's something that's going to be able to be abused on. And the same thing goes for, I think, their DPS line as well, where Sombra Tracer aren't terribly weak picks, but they're also not terribly strong. So Florida picks a composition that says, we want you to play Winston Sombra Tracer to us because we don't think you can play it. However, if you try any other variation, it's not going to work so well. You see, the best composition from what I have seen and from the theory of Overwatch 2 macro versus what Florida is playing is a very well executed Winston Sombra Tracer dive that would leverage more of the fragility of the Baptiste and Ashe compositions, even factoring in some of the countermeasures that Florida Mayhem have played. And I think you'll see that in the VOD below. Now, moving on from this to the second level of the quick summation, let's actually go through each hero's responsibility and why they're being played in this composition. So again, the theory of the composition is about controlling space before the dive actually happens and having really only the Ashe being the fragile, isolatable target. So that starts with Ramattra. Now, why are teams playing Ramattra? Or why is Florida specifically playing Ramattra? You see, when we think of anti-dive tanks, our first thought is something like the Junker Queen, as I broke down last week, maybe the Diva, and so on. But the Ramattra is very unique compared to those two heroes in one particular aspect. He's very, very survivable when you compare him to Junker Queen, who's a lot more fragile. And compared to Diva, he does significantly more pre-fight pressure / has a significantly more impactful ult. You see, Diva is great at surviving. She's an excellent anti-dive tank for marking Winstons and controlling DPS, but her ultimate is not very impactful and she doesn't do a lot of range pressure poke to control space and pressure out dive early. That's something that more Junker Queen and Ramattra do. But then if you play Junker Queen, you're significantly more fragile than Ramattra or Diva, and so Ramattra is kind of the best of both worlds. Now, what Ramattra lacks is verticality. but that's also something that wasn't as much of a factor on the maps where we saw more Ramattra being played. In fact, on maps where the verticality was more of an issue, you would see someone immediately swap to D.Va, which makes total sense. So Ramattra's entire job is to survive and put out early pre-fight pressure, force Winston bubble, force and control the enemy backline from being able to do anything on their own. And then when the Ramattra feels like an isolatable target, he's going to pop his nemesis and he's going to be able to survive. Meanwhile, Merit, Checkmate, Chorong, and RuPaul are doing really whatever the heck they want. So Ramattra, you just survive and you put pre-fight poke. That's pretty much all he needs to do. And someone was doing a phenomenal job at not only the pre-fight poke, not only being resource light, allowing every other member of the composition of Florida to play aggressively without having to worry about him, but he's also getting really, really impactful ults mid-fight when all those dive cooldowns were down. Moving on from there to the DPS, Tracer. This one is pretty self-explanatory. Tracer is not only the best dive hero in the entire game, she is ironically the best anti-dive hero in the game. You see, if you can control angles, you can stop the dive from ever happening. If you can mark the Tracer, then the Tracer can't dive your backline. If you can shoot the Sombra can't shoot your backline. But Checkmate just wasn't doing only that. He was also going for backline, limiting how aggressively the enemy backline could punish his team. He was also shooting tanks and making it really hard for the tanks to be able to walk forward without taking a lot of pressure. Checkmate just took the best and juiciest off angle that he could possibly take and did so with impunity for most of all of the series that he played in. And not only was he doing that well, but he was doing that well because a lot of the time he had a pocket. And this pocket was Kiriko. Now, Kiriko is another one of those ironic anti-dive, but also dive supports at the same time, because like a Tracer, her job is to control space and pressure. Now, what Kiriko does is she can play anywhere that she possibly could want to. Any off angle with Tracer, any flank, she's impossible to dive. But not only that, she doesn't have to play with Tracer. She can even play for herself, for her own DPS off angle, creating not only a crossfire of 2 or 3 angles, but as many as 4, as we saw in many times in the Mayhem, where there was literally not a corner that you could play around where you weren't getting shot by at least one member of Mayhem. In addition, in situations where Florida wanted to play slower or more to peel their Baptiste and Ashe, Kiriko healing and Suzu are still very, very, very powerful cooldowns, and Kiriko is serviceable. But mostly, control space, play DPS Kiriko with Checkmate, just completely ruin the dive's ability to stage a dive cleanly without getting cooldowns forced. Kiriko will not let you do that, especially when she can play for herself, which is exactly what this composition is designed to do. Moving on to that, the second DPS, which will smack dab in here, and this one is definitely one of the more unique picks, something that I think could have been replaced with either Sojourn or Sombra in certain circumstances, but Merit's a phenomenal Ashe, so you're going to play Ashe. Now, Ashe is not an anti-dive hit scan by any means. However, she does have the defensive cooldown of Coach Gun, she has mid-range, and she has one of the best hit scan or just damage ultimates in the entire game. Bob isn't a fight turner necessarily all on its own, but it is significantly more powerful than a lot of the other hit scan ultimates. And Coach Gun gives her some vertical survivability, gives her a defensive cooldown, and the way that the Florida Mayhem were controlling space, they often meant that RuPaul was full pocketing Merit, so even if Merit died, there was going to be punish elsewhere. We'll get to that topic in just a little bit of a second. But again, it's about pressure. Merit is going to play with a little bit of ego, because we know if Merit gives up too much space and plays too cowardly, then the enemy dive is going to be able to set up a dive if they want to. We're willing to let Merit get under a lot of threat and under a lot of pressure if it means that he's going to be able to get out early pressure. And there's something else that you saw Merit would do is Merit would back off when he get dove, get full back peel, almost die, and then as soon as those cooldowns were used, obviously we're seeing someone, Checkmate, and Chorong hard punishing that dive at the same time, and then Merit walks right back after those dive cooldowns and starts right over again. And so many fights were just won because Merit hit a shot either before or after the dive, and that RNG dice roll is something that a composition like this is really going to benefit from. The last piece here, and another similar to Ashe, unique piece, is the Baptiste. And the Baptiste has a very interesting thing, okay? His job is just to survive and help his Ashe to survive as well. Now, in a lot of other compositions, Baptiste plays a little bit more proactively with his pressure, but the problem with that is to be able to proactively pressure, you have to take more aggressive positions, as we talked about earlier. That would compromise Baptiste's ability to survive, but also would compromise his ability to control and support his Ashe, who is the more important pressure resource. So at least in the Overwatch League, and at least in this compositional matchup, RuPaul was playing mostly to just be as difficult and as hard to isolate and kill as he possibly can, baiting a lot of dives and taking so long to die that by the time that he actually did die, that chaos had happened everywhere else. His priority is to survive, use his cooldowns well, and then mid-fight, once these cooldowns are used, similarly to Ramattra ult, look for those windows, look for that DPS and offensive pressure, and obviously leveraging his high ground accessibility as much as he possibly can. So each of these resources, each of these responsibilities are very important. How it actually applies in a match, though, is another thing coming. Now, what I have here is I have an example of pretty much every matchup, or at least the most important matchups that we saw with this composition from the 2 games that Florida Mayhem played. Dive, Spam, Brawl, and Paul, Junker, Town, King's Row. Now, if you are looking for some more in-depth analysis and more visual examples of what I'm talking about, we're going to get into that right now. So I have a few timestamps here. Now, this is one take, and this is going to be as quickly and as efficiently as we possibly can. However, this is going to be thorough, so I recommend you to grab some water because we're going to be here for a little bit here. So the first thing here I want to point out as I got my notes here is in the match versus the Toronto Defiant, Florida Mayhem are opening up on the Ramattra anti-dive composition. Now this is really cute because not only does Ramattra provide value, I'm actually pull up Epic here, not only does it provide value versus the Winston dive, but the Ramattra is straight up better versus the Junker Queen matchup because the pre-spam from shield and his weapon is significantly better than Junker Queen. Both of these heroes are anti-dive versus Winston. This hero is better versus the Winston maybe in the 1v1, but this hero is significantly better versus the Junker Queen. So I think Toronto is expecting Florida to open up on Winston dive here. That would be my best guess. And this is the thing with Florida, guys. Florida is a dangerous team. You do not know what they're going to open. They've showed competence in a lot of heroes. So are they going to open up on Winston dive, something that they dominated on the Pro-Am? You know, what do you open up on? So they're going to roll out on the Ramattra composition. Now I want you guys to notice exactly what happens here. Look at how aggressively someone is going to be playing, basically using himself as bait. Merritt's taking an aggressive off angle in the corner. RuPaul's going to be in the back. You've got Checkmate and Chorong hard flanking on the back line. And remember, it's all about 1, 2, and 3, 4, sometimes just these 3 as a unit, putting as much early pressure as possible, because even though this isn't technically a dive composition, we really don't want this group to be able to rotate onto my Baptiste. And I guarantee you that as soon as Toronto saw this composition, they're thinking, guys, we have to find a way to rotate onto the Baptiste. But guess what? Look at RuPaul. RuPaul has already rotated far left side of our screen. And even if someone dies, what is it going to cost us to chase this far? Look at that. Someone's just holding block, holding block, holding block, holding block, and look at how many angles that they've maintained here. And now you've got Mayhem that are stuck or controlling the entire map, whereas to Defiant are stuck into a choke. And it's up to Defiant at this point to make a hero play, which may or may not happen. You have a Hanzo on an angle, Tracer on an angle, Kiriko on an angle, forcing shout. Now Ramattra's able to walk back out and spam, and it's going to mean that Defiant are just going to have to end up giving the point and giving up the fight. Now, moving up to here, Toronto is going to swap to the Winston, which, as I said, I do feel is the best counter to this composition when executed well. I'm not as big of a fan of the Sojourn and Genji, but obviously the old economy demands that they stay on this. Now, the funny thing with this fight here is they actually missed the scouting on Merritt, who's playing a ridiculously aggressive flank on the left side. Merritt might have been hiding, but regardless, look at how far they have to go. They've already forced Kaluja's bubble. Look at how aggressive. Again, look at the aggression from these 3 members of the Mayhem. They are not waiting to peel dive. They are punching you in the mouth the second that you walk out, trying to force as many. Look at the damage that's already been done to Hydra and Kaluj here. As much damage as they possibly can, as much pressure as they possibly can. And so Kaluj already gets his bubble force. Hydra's 1 HP. Speedily has to commit his dash just to reach. And yes, they kill RuPaul, but at what cost? And that's the thing, is you actually ironically end up getting your backline traded significantly more often because you're reaching so far. And you're going to notice this a lot from especially the Defiant, where the Defiant, I don't want to break this is not a Defiant review, but Defiant specifically struggled when they couldn't reach the backline. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to threaten the Baptiste and isolate the tank. They weren't able to make that work on any composition, and that's largely the reason why they lost. Now, why that was a problem, that's another layer that we'd have to analyze. But that's the big thing here. Just so much damage, okay? We're going to move on to 5650, and we're going to have another matchup here. Now, in theory, once again, we do like what Toronto does. You can even notice that the Kiriko Tracer on the flank are easily cleared by this 3-man crew. I don't like the Ana. I think the Ana gives a hero that, even though it's good versus Ramattra in the 1v1 matchup, theoretically, because of sleep and nade, I think the Ana gives a backline for Ramattra to control. One of the weaknesses of Ramattra, especially compared to something like a Winston Diva, something like that, is that the Ramattra doesn't have the mobility. So if you can bait and control angles and then take the dive here and Ramattra Ramattra's stuck here trying to pre-poke. If you jump over the Ramattra, he's going to be spent chasing back, and that is not something that you want to be doing. Instead, Ramattra can just hold your on and Lucio at the choke, and I don't like that. I think the Kiriko is by far the better play. That being said, good play from Toronto Defiant, clearing the off angle here. Again, the lack of Sombra, the lack of dive tank means that these off angles should always be free to the dive team if it's played correctly and it's not within Merit's line of sight. And you're going to notice something here, that when they set up a nice dive with the Sombra off angle, Winston staging, they haven't taken a lot of damage. You notice that from Toronto. Then this is what we want to see. Do you see this? Even though Merit doesn't necessarily die, it's going to force a lot of cooldowns, shift, lamp, everything out. And theoretically here, if Toronto can properly reset and immediately turn their attention back on either someone or just reset on point and take their next set of cooldowns, they'll be able to punish the Defiant here, or to punish the Mayhem here. The problem is that Merit does a great job pushing back out, but Defiant really scuff up their timing. Again, this is not a Defiant thing, but my point here is that in theory, what Defiant just did is fine. They just need to rinse and repeat that over and over again. But they didn't do that. We have a complete mistiming from both of my DPS when my tank is out. So this is going to clear both of my DPS and then expose Kaluj a little bit later. And the problem is not what that fails to do, or not what it doesn't do enough. It's what it indirectly enables, which is it just allows Merit to walk back out in this angle. No Sombra pressure, no Tracer pressure, no Winston bubble, and it's going to reset. And every time Defiant does that, there's another chance for Merit to hit a headshot. I want you also to notice that someone was at the same time able to control the backline instead of having Kiriko Lucio directly TP into the middle of the enemy team, something that you can absolutely do when they're on these two heroes and just dive, but unfortunately not what happens. Now, and eventually, once the ult economies roll, especially on shorter sightline maps like this, you will see the dive team succeed, and that is something that Defiant eventually does once they blow all their ults. And you are going to see someone swap to the Diva, which I'm not going to break down this defense any further, but makes total sense, right? A lot of verticality. The Ramattra is going to have a lot harder time putting out early pressure, so Diva's going to do the exact same thing that the Ramattra was doing, which is ego and hard mark, but doing it from a high ground position is going to be useful, okay? Moving on from there, let's see here, 105. Let's look at the attack. Now, this is going to be a little bit more personal to the team that we're watching here and less more about the macro of the composition as a whole. If I can get this to load here, I've been having some issues with this. I might just have to refresh. Oh, there it goes immediately as I do so. So one of the things that I was noticing is that it feels like Kaluj was having a much harder time avoiding pressure and avoiding damage. You see Hydran calling out BAP, BAP, BAP. This is the composition they're running out. They get a little bit of hack, a little bit of scouting, someone's getting pressured. But you're going to notice something here, okay? So Chorong and Checkmate try to wrap around behind, but Kaluj, Hydran speedily, they're waiting for it. And they're able to punish Chorong because he uses his TP and then he gets isolated out. Checkmate does get behind and destroys Translocator, but this is the big thing right here, okay? This is the thing that Defiant were really, really struggling with, right? They're able to isolate it out. Where's the timestamp I'm looking for here? I think it's this fight. Yeah, this is the fight I'm looking for right here. So first off, big thing here. You've got a Ramattra on point. You've got people walking forward, the Sombra Tracer, but there's just, there has to be a dive here, guys. Like the big thing is here is that you've got the Sombra angle from Hydran. I don't know where Speedily is. He might be actively being marked by Checkmate right now. But the problem is that, like, where's Kaluj? Where's Speedily? I can't have both my Ashe and Baptiste like standing this close and not being dove. And if we turn around, Speedily is late, Hydran is out, and then if I turn around, Kaluj is peeling off on someone. And this is where my concern with the Winston execution comes in, and the dive execution from Toronto as a whole. You can't do this Winston. You can't, like, maybe this has been at a time in the past where it was okay to do this in prior metas, but you cannot let a Baptiste and Ashe just stand on the high ground for this, and you're bubbling off the Ramattra heal. Ramatra's just going to block and walk right back out again. And so now, I mean, look at the angles and map control that that Mayhem have now. And Defiant can't dive this. They don't have Winston bubble. Their Sombra's not set up. Their Tracer just got cleared. All you have now are RNG dice rolls about whether Merit is going to be hitting a shot. And that's a huge problem. So now the dive heroes are now the defenders or the attackers rather than vice versa. You've now lost so much space here. So, and this is a consistent theme. I'm not going to play a lot of clips from all these fights, but I want you to kind of show that, like, this is why Toronto was struggling here. Now, Mayhem is very much expecting a sniper mirror here, and I think that would have been a better choice for the Defiant. But obviously, they've had success with this composition in scrims. Maybe this is what they thought would be better in the moment. It just doesn't end up working out. Mayhem's ready to walk out in Sigma, but then they see Dive. They probably saw D.Va there and like, okay, we're going to go anti-Dive. We're going to go pull out our composition again. And again, the strength of this composition is if you can control the Sombra Tracer and keep the Defiant under constant pressure, you will be able to keep Merit alive. Now, Merit won't greed the Widow, too fragile, but these heroes are supportable if we can get Checkmate, Merit, someone, and Chorong putting out as much pressure as they possibly can. Pressure, 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 pressure. And the D.Va, while controlling the Tracer better, loses a lot of dive on the enemy backline. So it's going to be almost entirely up to Hydran and Speedily to actually get kills on Merit, which is a little bit of a problem. I don't like the D.Va as much on first point for that very same reason. I think that the D.Va is only going to be controlling Tracer. I don't think there's a lot that she can do. She doesn't win the trade with Ramattra heavily enough, and I think that's a huge problem. Now, I want to point out one other little tiny detail that you Kiriko players might learn from, not to mention the macro from. The Kiriko brings so much to the table here, and there's a good argument that Kiriko could be something that we see more in dive, and spam mirrors, if that ever comes back. Because one thing that Kiriko does that Zenyatta doesn't, it's just flip and take any angle that she wants. So she does a lot less DPS, but remember, deep shield damage isn't really relevant in spam mirrors and hasn't been since Orisa Sigma has come into play. So what the Kiriko does is allows her, she's basically allowed to play any angle that she wants. This is not the timestamp that I was looking for here. I'll get to that later. She's basically, actually, you know what, we'll skip to that right now. So 127.55, she basically is able to play like a third DPS, and so the damage that she gets stats on terms of shields and tanks is a lot lower, but she's able to actually pressure Tracers and Widowmakers and Snipers a lot more. I mean, even look at this right here, right? Look at the concern that Hydran has, okay? Okay, the shooting Tracer, the Tracer peeks here, and then Hydran starts getting shot, and then look at this is absurd. He peeks back, where is my Kiriko? Right here. I mean, look at this. This Kiriko, imagine playing here as Zenyatta. It would never, ever, ever happen. And just the nature of the spamming of the kunai, it's a lot of sniper pressure, and you will see a lot of sniper kills or even just sniper zone from that. So the Kiriko playing super aggressively with Tracer is something that Zenyatta wishes he could do, but something that he can't do. And then backing off of that, my timestamp on 29.25 demonstrates that even further, because it's not just about the spamming, it's also about the positions that Kiriko can take to control snipers that Zenyatta could only dream of. Case in point, Checkmate blinks across on the opposite high ground, and Chorong follows. I mean, look at the Colosseum positioning here. Again, this is not something that Zenyatta can do. The other thing with Kiriko as well is because Kiriko can position here, this is really hard for a Widowmaker to deny the sightline, right? Where can she peek that the Kiriko can't just dome her? Whereas Zenyatta stuck over here, or here, or if Zenyatta's feeding even here, a lot of these positions are a lot more punishable by enemy Widowmakers. Kiriko can take much shorter sightlines. But going back a little bit to why the Toronto were struggling just a little bit, because I do think it's relevant with how you beat this composition, because remember, the weakness of this composition is that it relies on Checkmate, Chorong, and someone playing aggressively and then getting punished as a result. So in other words, you need these like baits to play baity and then not get burnt so that you can actually win. I mean, look at this right now, right? Kiriko Tracer playing hyper aggressive on the flank, looking to off-angle pressure. Ramattra basically completely by himself, all totally isolated. You're gonna have RuPaul and Merit super far back, but you can't have them taking super aggressive sightlines because they just get immediately dove. And this is where the weakness of Mayhem's composition comes into play, and this is why a really good Sombra Tracer team, Winston or not, preferably Winston, would do really well versus this composition. Someone gets hacked here and naded. Actually, I don't even know if he gets hacked, but he gets naded, he gets isolated from multiple off-angles, and then he gets slept, right? And just those cooldowns alone are going to force Nemesis, they're going to force Shield, they're going to force E, they're going to force Lamp, and that right now someone is in immense danger. He has to back up. He has to back up. He can no longer hold space in Nemesis form. And this is what Toronto is missing. And this is what teams that play versus this composition need to do. You need to punish Checkmate and Chorong on the flank, or at least get rid of them. You need to recognize when someone is totally isolated. And even if you don't have a hack, whatever your composition provides in terms of cooldown value and pressure, you need to focus this guy down. If Merit and RuPaul are over here, they're often not in really good positions to punish you for focusing someone. and a lot of the time someone was baiting well, and people were chasing and dropping onto someone directly in front of RuPaul and Merit. That's something that you can't do. And I think better teams are going to be able to leverage and punish this. And this is why I don't think this composition is going to be quote unquote meta. Could be wrong, but I think the fragility of Baptiste and Ashe are still weak points of this composition. Even things like the Kiriko Tracer on the flank, like just match them with your own Kiriko Tracer, but you also have a Sombra and you also have a Winston. And this is like classic example, right? Where Toronto actually took a fairly decent neutral, occasionally, not always, and they would get a kill, right? Someone doesn't have his kills, he gets isolated, but then Checkmate would just hit a pulse bomb, or Merit would just hit a headshot, or someone would hit a mid-fight Nemesis Ramattra and kill somebody. And this kept happening over and over and over again. So a lot of mechanical misplays, or good plays from Florida Mayhem that were winning them a lot of fights when the macro got exploited just a little bit here. Okay, now I want to move on to the next match here, and this is going to be a little bit of a different perspective as well, because I think the Gladiators offered something that was a little bit unique, because this was a more of a quote-unquote Ryan Brawl short-range matchup. Now, immediately as soon as I saw this composition, I was thinking, they're going to immediately take, like, this is going to be setting up to control off angles, Kiriko Tracer playing together. And I remember doing this on live stream, right? And my first thought was, Gladiators, do not go to point. You will not lose point. You're going to get off-angle Colosseo'd, right? Or Colosseum'd, excuse me. And that's exactly what happened. Like, someone plays bait. You have all the DPS taking all the off-angles in the world, but Kai clutches them out for him, because Kai actually takes the high ground himself. And what funnily enough happens, Kai actually takes an off-angle and does pretty good with it. However, the high ground control from this composition is so strong. What I would like to see from Gladiators is actually rotate and try and clear high ground at some point. And they end up winning this fight, not just from this right here, but actually in this fight from this. And this is exactly what you need to be doing. RuPaul gets caught with his pants down, and the vertical, you can just push these guys out. If you're able to push them out, that's what you need to be doing. Because remember, this composition will beat you in angles, but if you match them toe to toe, as this composition with the Ramattra, May, Lucio, you will run them over. And that is where the fights where Gladiators won were from, just exactly that. Okay, so let's skip ahead to 2025. Case in point, right? You're not going to be able to meet the May Lucio comp toe to toe. So what do? You flank. You flank with Kiriko Lucio, and you pray that your Baptiste and Ramattra don't die too fast. And that's exactly what happens here. Right now, I do think RuPaul and someone do die, but it takes them a long time to die. And by the time they do die, Gladiators have used every cooldown in the game and lost all of the off angles, and then ended up getting pincered. And what felt like should have been a Gladiators free fight win actually ends up going to the Mayhem, albeit with a couple of panic ultimates. Now, again, map control is everything in Overwatch, and this composition is just so good at that. So if you are Gladiators and you're not able to quickly run down RuPaul and someone, or clear out the Kiriko Ashe Tracer on flanks, then you're going to lose. And essentially, this entire map was just whether Gladiators could clear space, whether they could ignore the space or not. And if they couldn't, they struggled. Again here, we're going to see a really nice rotation. Actually, I'm skipping ahead. There's a couple of fights where Kiriko Tracer goes on flanks. Now, this fight is super interesting, and this is why Mayhem lost. Mayhem in general, in fights, even when they had ult disadvantage, generally played very bravely with the Ramattra, Tracer, and Kiriko especially. But you're going to notice something here, that Mayhem knows that Kevster, Kai, Lastro, Astro, all got their brawl ultimates. They just want to run them down. So what ends up happening is Mayhem makes a really big mistake. They play this one way too slow. They give up too much space. They play too cowardly. What I would have liked to see from the Mayhem here is Hanzo, maybe even Baptiste or Kiriko, play the long flank here. Tracer plays aggressively from the high ground. You have your Ramattra playing super ballsy up here with the Baptiste in the back. And basically what happens is Mayhem loses because they're so scared of these brawl ultimates that they end up playing stacked. Right? You see how stacked we are here? We got 1, 2, 3 members of Mayhem, all the squishies, and I guess to a lesser extent 4. So really Mayhem don't have any off angles. And so the funny thing here is this is exactly how Gladiators win. Gladiators don't even necessarily need to do a whole lot, because there's no threat from the Hanzo. There's no threat from the Kiriko on your backline. There's no threat. You see, the Kiriko and the Baptiste are hard focusing on pocketing the Ramattra, but it's not good enough. You're not going to win by hard pocketing someone. You're going to win by having one person hard pocket someone while the Kiriko is killing the backline, right? And the irony here is that Chorong, because he's inside of his own backline instead of on a flank as he should be, he ends up getting frozen by something that wasn't even intended for him in the first place, and dies to a dragon as well. So flanks matter, and as soon as that falls apart, you can't execute this composition, and that's why I don't think many teams are going to be able to execute this, even if it becomes a niche composition. I don't think teams are good enough at understanding the game. I'm going to be honest with you. I think the Overwatch, especially in the West, I think a lot of Western teams are just bad at understanding map control, and I think this composition demands you to understand map control, otherwise you will not be able to play it. Now, another great thing about this composition, as we've already said, is the vertical mobility. Obviously on third point King's Row, having some heroes that can climb high grounds, Baptiste, Kiriko, Hanzo, just phenomenal. Like, I think at this point in time, like a Mei Lucio feels really, really quite bad. And it was no surprise to me, especially when Checkmate went to Genji, this is a really, really cool composition. There's just so many angles that they can take as Mayhem, and the Baptiste can play so far back and essentially be inaccessible. So I loved watching this. This was just great fundamental Overwatch, I think, from not only the compositional choice but the execution from the Mayhem. I mean, just look at the Genji right there. Genji with a little bit of Kiriko pocket just immediately clears that high ground, and something that I just was really in love with the Mayhem. I think the only thing Glads could have done is probably try to rotate out through here and maybe try to rotate onto the Baptiste from inside this room here, leveraging their Mei. But again, phenomenal execution here. Let's keep going here. So the attack now. Hey, what's up? Yeah, sure. Do you mind? So basically, they roll out on anti-dive the gladiators, and again, this is why I think like the gladiators. The Mayhem are really dangerous because they go, oh, you think we're gonna run Winston? Just kidding, we're gonna run a composition that beats your anti-dive comp, and this composition does a really good job at that. So obviously the Junker Queen and the Torbjorn were just that, and then they go, oh crap, they're gonna run this composition, that's cringe. And then again, you're just gonna see more of the same, where just more flanking, more off angles, just all sorts of foolishness going on. This is, where's the timestamp looking at it right here, right? I mean, look at this. This is insanity, right? Tracers in the back line, you have your Kiriko in the back line, you have your Hanzo in the off angle. I mean, like, look at this, right? Like, and then the Kiriko gets low and just TPs out again. And then all that attention that you put in the Kiriko is just completely wasted. She's inside of her own team healing and doing damage. And so obviously this is a really, really good point for the Gladiators composition. I think the Gladiators composition is probably fine. It's just really, really hard to beat it when the Mayhem are executing as well as they are here. Again, another situation where you have Hanzo, Bap, Kiriko, Tracer flank, all the off angles are controlled by Mayhem. I think Gladiators may have needed to somehow find a way to wall up on one of these high grounds, but this composition has so much vertical mobility, very difficult to execute. And then from here, it's like once we get to this point in the map, their composition is just unstoppable. There's just not a lot that you can do. The only weak point here is maybe the Ramattra, but the Ramattra is fine for just a cart anchor. And then like you have a Bat, pocket Tracer can flank high ground, 3, 2, 1. We're gonna peek out here, and then look at this. Watch the Kiriko on the flank here. Kiriko Tracer blinks across, Kiriko TPs, and then just immediately clears them from high ground, and then they use those positions to kill. I mean, it's just the Kiriko Tracer Hanzo Bat combo in the high grounds is just unreal. Like, it's really unreal on maps where you can't play dive. I think it's really, really well done. And then let's move on to the last example, because obviously Glads win this match, and they played really, really well. I've watched this match live, one of the best matches of the entire season, if not the best match of the entire season. So let's talk about this. Again, Glads are like, surely they're gonna play Winston dive because this is a pretty good dive map, but no, they don't. Again, they roll it in their counter comp. Now, I was surprised to see this on this map until I realized that they're just gonna put RuPaul as quickly as they can over here on these high grounds. Same thing goes to the Ashe, so this comp is actually fairly decent here. And this is where I think it leans a little bit into the we don't think Gladiators can play Winston. Because I do think Winston comp is better on this map, and I think the result spoke for itself, but obviously Dante has the same idea, right? He's gonna go Winston. I do think that this map is too short in sightlines, and even with the high ground mobility, I think Sombra Tracer and Winston are just straight up too good. And I think case in point, like, could that have been executed better by Mayhem? Yes, but if they're able to set up the off angles and get onto the Ashe, either the Ashe dies or it forces a lot of resources and they win the map as a result. And so what ends up happening here is essentially Dante goes, or whoever on Gladiators goes, guys, we just need to go Winston, and then it comes down to a skill matchup of like, will we be able to execute our Winston composition into this composition. And I think a lot of people were asking me in chat, why didn't Mayhem swap? Now, I think you could have made a pretty good argument that Merit should have swapped right here to something like a Sojourn or a Sombra. But the problem is this is kind of not, I wouldn't say an all-in, but you can tell that these guys have not only practiced this composition, but they're not really in a great position to swap. Now, you could do a double swap here, but it might not be super tight. And the other thing too is like, it doesn't matter if this composition technically beats this composition on paper, if this is the composition that these guys have been practicing and that they're confident that they just need to execute better. Because you can look back at this and I can say almost for certain that Gladiator's comp is better. It's better on this map. It just is. But that's the people that run the better composition don't win the majority of games in Overwatch. It's the people that run the composition executed better. See, running the proper composition is only I wouldn't say a small percentage, but it's not the most important percentage here. And especially if you've been putting practice time on a specific composition, that's what we're putting more emphasis on. So huge swap by the Glads. Also happens to be a composition that Glads are relatively comfortable on, and you can see it right here. If they're able to stage onto the Ashe like this without getting marked, without getting scouted, I mean, this is just, even though they don't get the kill immediately, it's over. Like, as soon as I saw this, I knew that if Glads could actually execute this, it was over, and indeed it was. So huge credit goes to the Glads here, but also huge credit to Florida for coming up with one of the more unique compositions that we've seen all year. And also executing on it really well. You could definitely argue that Florida deserved this one. I also highly recommend checking out New Queen Street. You can see a little bit of the rock, paper, scissors with tank swaps there, and a surprising last second win by the Gladiators on that map as well. So all that being said, I do not think this composition is something that we're going to see a ton, but we might continue to see it from Mayhem, and we might see flavors or inspirations of it used by other teams. For example, the aggressive Kiriko Tracer playing on an off angle is not necessarily unique, but something that we're for sure going to continue to see, especially in on a Kiriko compositions as well. I think you might see more Ramattra being played as anti-dive if they can play it to the level that someone did. It's not the perfect anti-dive here. It definitely has its major weaknesses, but it does perform on some maps. And I also think that just maybe the most impactful swap is that Merit is proving that, hey, just because Hitscan is weak right now doesn't mean it's not playable. And that, I think, was the biggest surprise to me. The RuPaul swap on Baptiste, that is super weird. I don't think we're going to see a lot of teams playing that. It's more of a swap niche for Mayhem because they have RuPaul who can play the hero amazingly well. But the Ashe is definitely something that other teams that I think could steal. And I think we might continue to see moving forward on maps where that is viable. So let me know if you have any questions in the comments. Probably a longer analysis than you wanted, but I think the reason why I love this so much is it just wasn't an interesting thing. It was also a very informative thing about how Overwatch was being played. Now, I'm not a huge Mayhem fan. I'm not really a huge fan of really any team in the Overwatch League, but I am a fan of tight, well-executed, creative Overwatch, and Mayhem not only delivered that, but delivered that in spades this weekend. Like I said, let me know if you have questions to comment, and enjoy the video. That's already finished, I guess.